Do we know where specifically the language came from? What, I guess, language families kind of make up the the language as it's spoken and as it has been spoken in the United States over time?
Well, the the short answer is yes, but in the same sense that we know how all languages come about. Um, English is not a language in and of itself that just kind of came about by way of like spontaneous combustion. No matter what a lot of English speakers insist upon, which they seem to believe, like, oh no, 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 English was just born whole,
Right.
already an adult language that didn't derive from anything. But all languages evolve from some form of communication before it. It's like some system of communicating that came before it, whether it's words, or well, all they're all sounds of some kind, even if it's percussion. But um, in that sense, uh, there's of course the English side. It's an English based Afro-Indigenous Creole. The base coming from the fact that it's the lexifier of the colonizer who imposed it upon us. So, we were forced to speak the language, and so that ends up being the basis for the language is English, and that's why a lot of English speakers can understand a lot of the words that we in phrases that we have in common because it's a Creole
Right.
in that regard. Um, and so you want if you go down the rabbit hole of where English came from, that's a whole, Latin and Germanic languages, there's that part of it. um but what's less often explored is the African origin of our language, and also the indigenous influences of our language. I'm from a place where very many, like you see how out west you see a lot of cities and places, roads, things like that that have Spanish names.
Right.
Las Vegas, Los Angeles, like all of those have Spanish names. Well, I'm from a place where there are a lot of indigenous names, Wadmala, Wando. A lot of these names are actually names from the indigenous tribes that were there, and including some of the names that we use, like, Wanda. A lot of names that people think are made up Black names,
Hmm.
which all names are made up, by the way. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean, but all names are made up, but um, are actually from our indigenous roots. And in fact, with the Ogeechee River, that is considered to be one of the possible inspirations for the name Geechee, is like the Ogeechee River,
Hmm.
including the Guale people, being one of the theorized influences for Gullah. And so that is also a part of the indigenous influence. Now, of course, there's a divide among some within the community as to what percentage of our lineage is African versus indigenous, et cetera. That's a debate for another time, but there is influence from both sides. So um, the languages that went into it, creating Gullah, if you think about the circumstances that the language was created, what we're talking about is something that began on continental Africa. Contrary to popular belief, the beginnings of the language didn't begin on the plantation. Um, the ingredients, so to speak, the ingredients for the gambo will come from someplace, from somewhere else, and came together um, in the Sea Islands and the Low Country, and spread out throughout the region, including the Caribbean, by the way. But we'll get
Hmm.
to
Yes.
that. Um, but the beginnings of it as a pidgin began in Africa, and it formed into a Creole in the United States from a pidgin. So, to make the distinction, I'm sure your audience already knows this, but hey, I'll just say just for the record, the distinction between a pidgin and a Creole. A pidgin being essentially a utilitarian form of speaking, that language that takes multiple languages, perhaps, two languages, and blends them in a way for both speakers of each individual language to be able to communicate with one another. But it's not necessarily a whole language of its own. In a sense, it's kind of like Spanglish.
Mm.
Um, but then a Creole is once those two languages come together and start to create their own individual rules. You take some from here, some from there, put them together, and then you come up with this third set of rules that doesn't necessarily adhere to either one of the languages. And you continue to do that. And if it survives a generation, that very next generation of speakers of that pidgin are now speaking a Creole, a language that's mature and adult language of its own. And as time goes on, you'll start to see more independence from both of their languages, but they'll still favor, like, oh, you favor your mama, you know, they'll still you show favor to where it came from, and you can see a lot of that in Gullah now. It still shows very strong favor to our African lineage, and unfortunately, that's something that when you live in a broader context that favors English as the dominant language, um, and you are speaking this very Africanized uh, language with accent and all, um, that's going to be stigmatized as and associated as ignorant and uneducated, unsophisticated. It's not a prestige language or prestige
Right.
accent, so to speak. And so that might influence some people's willingness to uh, associate themselves with the language or to speak it fluently. And we see some of that even with like first generation immigrants, where you might have a friend that you didn't even know was Nigerian. Like, I had no idea this dude was from Ghana. Like, whoa, until they go home. You go home with them and listen to their parents. It's like, wow, you really mastered this sort of English, stush, way of speaking, this Yankee speech. And because they understand what happens when they go to school, when they go to work,
Mm.
they get it. And that, so just imagine that happening over the course of generations, um, separating people from their mother tongue, but you don't actually have your African mother or father in the house with you to remind you of it. So that's kind of what we're doing. It's a miracle that so much of our Africanness is still preserved in the language and the culture, given that the space that's been put between us and our African origins.
Right.